football folk is doing. Last week they had Brady. This week they got Brady.
We're doing it. We're literally doing it differently from everybody else.
As a matter of fact, moving forward from this point on, I will not make reference to PFF.
Ready to get into it?
Yeah.
All right. We're going team by team.
I would be very careful about slinging stuff.
Am I going to get sued?
We got legal on this?
That sends you out on the right note. PFF sucks. Have a great day, everybody.
Wow.
Welcome into the PFF NFL podcast. Steve Palazzolo, Sam Monson, and soon Arif Hasan will join us to talk clutch NFL quarterback play. But first, as a busy parent, you want to give your kids a head start in their financial future, but investing can often be both confusing and time-consuming. But Fabric by Gerber Life makes it easy for you to set up an investment account for your child that grows with them and helps prepare for their financial future. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a UGMA account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. UGMA stands for Uniform Gifts to Minors Act. So while your kids can invest while they're minors, a UGMA account allows you to invest on their behalf and gives their investments more time to grow. So join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. That's meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. meetfabric.com/PFFNFL. Portfolio is managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Additional services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Monthly minimum contribution required. Learn more at meetfabric.com. Let's bring in Arif.
When you got to rush through the ad reads, that's really, you're a clutch.
Thank you. We are defining clutch here today. When we have JT O'Sullivan on, when we have Arif on here, I get through the ad with impeccable
See, when you got
pronunciation.
When you got time, you can't talk.
Can't do it.
When you have to get it done in 6 seconds, boom.
That's right. Game's on the line. Arif, how you doing, man? Welcome.
Nope.
Oh, no. He's muted.
Oh no. I got it. No
Press the button.
Uh,
there we go.
I'm good though. How are you all?
Doing great.
Doing good.
Is this his first time? Is this your first time on the show?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, now you can be a friend of the show. Finally. It's about time. So you're here because you wrote an entire 10,000 plus words on clutch quarterbacks. Tell everybody about what you wrote, where you wrote it, and what you're doing, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I wrote it over at wildleft.football, which is my Substack. It's this, like you said, it's 10,000 words, in exploration basically on, what clutchness is in sports, like not just in the NFL, and kind of how that applies to the way that we think about, quarterbacks, the way that we think about how we evaluate quarterbacks, whether or not it makes sense for us to think of clutchness as like a separate trait and all that. So huge piece, obviously, willing to go over it in a lot of detail here. But yeah, I've been independent for about a year now, and it allows me the time to do stuff like spend 10,000 words talking about one element of one position of play instead of having to do like a piece of news every day or something like that.
It really is a great piece. I urge everybody to go and read it. I love it because clutch is one of those things that everybody talks about, and it's always couched in sort of wishy-washy terms because it's really difficult to nail down. And this whole piece is about trying to do exactly that, trying to quantify, figure out what exactly we can say about clutch, and not just the kind of talk that everybody bullshits about it the whole time. At the start of your piece, you kind of go through and you talk to a bunch of people, data scientists, all those kinds of things, including PFF, Timo, and everybody that you spoke to mentioned when defining clutch this concept of elevating play in those clutch situations, in those higher pressure situations. Is there not a good argument that actually the most important, like clutch to me is actually just not choking? Like it's the absence of choke as opposed to the presence of a greater, like his ability to close in and actually nail the ad read when he has to get it done in 6 seconds. It's more just not screwing it up, right? I don't need you to nail it. I just need you to not collapse in a heap when you're under pressure.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Everybody that I talked to kind of mentioned that like offhand as the possible, way that we relate to clutchness, right? That, maybe everybody gets worse, but some people get less worse, or some people maintain their level of play. And I wanted to keep that in mind while I went through this whole process. And actually, what you're saying is ultimately how it does express itself. So, there's a lot of ways to measure the quality of play. Of course, I use Pro Football Focus grades at some point throughout the piece to help kind of define the level of play, that a quarterback is demonstrating. And what I found is that in clutch moments, quarterbacks all get worse, every single one of them. Like every quarterback that I had with like an appropriate sample size, I think I ended up with 46 of them with an appropriate sample size, both in clutch moments and outside of clutch moments. Every one of them got worse in clutch moments, but a lot of quarterbacks got a lot less worse, which, accords with that understanding, right? It's not that, players get better in these final moments. It's that a bunch of other players get noticeably worse. But the way that memory works isn't really like that. When you remember a clutch moment, you don't think, yeah, man, he hit that shot exactly like he always does. You think, oh my God, he made it. That rules. Like I'm glad he did that when it counted. Right. So that's really just the way that we remember these big plays. So we tend to think of it like someone is elevating their play or doing something that nobody would do, much less how they normally would do in these moments. And sometimes, like, we remember some average players as really, killing it in the clutch. Like Robert Horry with the Celtics was like a I don't know basketball very well, but was a name that showed up in a couple of these papers about clutchness. Is like, hey, this guy was like pretty decent, but man, when it counted, he was great. And that's how a lot of people remember it, and that's not really how it tends to express itself over time. It's just most people collapse a little bit under pressure, and a lot of really clutch players just don't collapse.
And that makes sense intuitively. That makes more sense intuitively to me than the idea that pressure actually creates a better version of the player. Like, to me, being an elite clutch performer in any area is simply the pressure doesn't affect you. So when everyone else gets worse, you don't, and you stay the course, and you don't do the Rory McIlroy, choke away a couple of short putts late in the final round when it's all there. Like that, you don't do that. Therefore, you win the major. Therefore, you're great and you're clutch. That makes way more sense to me than like you actually require the highest pressure moments to get the best version of that player out, which just seems like a very unlikely thing to exist.
Yeah, no, a lot of people who have talked about this have just wondered, like, why not make the whole plane out of the black box? Like, if you can be better at will, why not just be better, throughout most of the game? What's interesting is that those moments, those like oddities in terms of level of play, can trick you. I mean, it actually kind of reminds me of, I think you wrote a piece way back in, was it like 2013 that Tom Brady should retire or something like that? And man, it was frustrating because he was playing below his normal level of play, and then suddenly late in the fourth quarter he'd like engineer a drive and they'd win, and the Brady Patriots would continue winning games, and he's posting these poor career numbers, and you're like wondering what's going on. Is he actually getting better late in games? Why is he playing to the point where they need a fourth quarter comeback? If that feels like a very precarious position to be in, he should just play better most of the time if that's something that he's capable of. And there's like a lot of elements at play there. It turns out Tom Brady was actually still good at football. And hey, I was tricked too. I just didn't write it down for ESPN. I just wrote it for Twitter so nobody noticed. But it turns out that there are elements of play here in football that's a little bit different than anything else, where some players might be better at 2-minute drills, which occur in clutch moments, but are different strategic considerations, right? They require a different set of talents that Brady happens to be good at. And so I also wanted to test, like, what if you're good at 2-minute drills, but pressure is not an important element or a factor here? Like, what if the type of improvisational play that you're capable of, expresses itself well in situations where everybody kind of understands, that the ball is headed this way, that you can't, that you can't spend time, that you have to do no huddle. And so I tested it against 2-minute drills occurring at the end of the half when there's not really a ton of pressure, but it is still a 2-minute drill. And it turns out that is an expressible skill. And so that's another thing we have to pay attention to is that players like Brady are just good at the 2-minute drill when there's no pressure. And so when I constructed a model for, who's a clutch player, using PFF grades, the most important factor by far was just how good are they? Like just generally, like in non-clutch moments, how good are they? And that was a huge element. I think it was like 7 times as important as any other element. Then the next element was how good are they at 2-minute drills? And then the final element was, okay, how good are they when there's pressure? So there is some like element here where clutchness does exist a little bit. It's just so small compared to all of these other elements, including stuff that we maybe don't pay a ton of attention to, like the strategic element of being good at the 2-minute drill, which Brady was good at and tricked a lot of us in terms of his overall level of play. That, is another element here too. Like, ideally, someone is just good enough to just be good, and it's less that they elevate their level of play. But there are other things where it's like, yeah, they're better at no huddle than the defense is at defending the no huddle, and this is what happens.
So first off, we're not a basketball show here, but we do need to correct some misinformation. Robert Horry played for the Rockets, Lakers, and Spurs. Tons of championships.
Oh my gosh!
All sorts of championships.
Mistake that I've made.
It's okay. Crap. It's okay, Arif. It's okay. It wasn't part of the 10,000 words, but the dude nailed a lot of clutch threes intuitively. Not an NBA fan here either, but I was a big Rockets fan in the mid-'90s. Hakeem Olajuwon, star. So that's the first part. I was real interested in the other sports, right? Because I think what you just laid out is the differences in football, and not just the differences in football, but the differences in the quarterback. The quarterback dictates the situation more than any other position in sports. Maybe a basketball player gets to choose his shot, so there's elements of that. But like you talked about baseball a lot in the article, in the studies that have been done on baseball and clutch, and that was one of the some of the first studies that came out were like, well, hitters can't get better with runners in scoring position. They can't get better late in the game. And it kind of makes sense. Now, as a player, you might say, oh, I'm going to change my approach. I'm going to pitch differently. I'm going to look for a better pitch as a hitter. But I do believe over time that probably evens out, right? Like you can't really will yourself to just get a hit in the best situations versus in the first inning. But as a quarterback, you do get to dictate the situation. Now, if you're down a touchdown, I need to be more aggressive. Now, that doesn't mean that your production's going to be better or that your stats are going to be better. But if the goal is binary, win or lose, being more aggressive over time, if you have 100 of these opportunities and you're playing the game, if your game theory is correct, you're probably going to win more games, right? I mean, that's part of it. In addition to, like you said, the baseline skill that you're bringing to the table obviously matters the most, right? It's like John Skelton having great game theory doesn't matter if you can't hit a throw. So anyway, I just wanted to lay that, like, what did you see with that? The idea that quarterbacks in football, that's just different than baseball where you can't really control the situation. In basketball, there's some similarities because, hey, the other team knows you need a game-winning shot. They're going to play you differently. But theoretically, in baseball, they're not going to play you differently, pitch you differently. Basketball, they will a little bit. But in football, like you were saying earlier, must-pass situation, things are a little bit different from a contextual standpoint.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there's a little bit of a stronger effect here. The one issue is that football is just always going to be more difficult to measure because of all of the moving parts involved in football. So I think that there are some advantages here in terms of us being able to find clutch play for quarterbacks, and maybe at that point we don't even want to call it clutchness. We just want to call it another skill that they have, right? Quarterbacks that are a little bit better at unlocking that style of aggressive play, which is important because that was a problem that Aaron Rodgers had for a while. He was too afraid to throw interceptions late in games, and so he wasn't willing to make these aggressive throws. So his, passer rating in clutch moments would actually look all right. but then he wouldn't like be winning these games. And until he kind of changed his style of play, his comeback ability wasn't really there. And maybe we're constructing narratives too, but it seems like in the data that he wasn't willing to do that as much. And when you take a look at some of the guys that over that had like mid-length careers that have been a little bit better at those clutch moments, they tend to be guys that are more comfortable with that kind of aggressive play, because at some point an interception's as good as an incompletion, right? Because it's a loss. And so if you want to generate those wins, you have to have like a little bit of like Jameis Winston, I'm just going to throw it, man. Someone's coming down with the ball, and hopefully that means a touchdown for somebody. And certainly it's going to end the game, right? Losing by 14 is the same as losing by 7. So sometimes, that is like an element of play here. That was certainly a huge problem with Kirk Cousins. I cover the Vikings a lot, and Cousins would play like the exact same style of football late in games as he would early in games when the situation wouldn't call for it, until his final couple of years in Minnesota, which notably he had a different coach. He had Kevin O'Connell, who was, anecdotally, or if we want to create a narrative around, these coaches, probably a lot less concerned about Cousins making these mistakes, probably a little bit less neurotic than Mike Zimmer was about the quarterback, throwing a late interception, because sometimes that's just what you got to do.
I've said that on the show before, and people have completely misquoted me. So let me just get misquoted again. I think it was about Jordan Love last year. He threw a game-ending interception, and I said, well, the interception doesn't matter. And I said, in the context of if the game ends on an incompletion or an interception, it doesn't matter. If you're down a score, it doesn't really matter. A loss is a loss. It is a binary thing. So that there is something to that. Like, it's okay to throw an interception if in that moment you're trying to be aggressive and give yourself an opportunity to win, right? Whether it's a fourth down deflection or an interception. So just wanted to clarify that. But that's part of it, right? And that's why I think the stats are difficult. Like, the actual QB stats are difficult, because also the quarterback controls the run game, right? If you check to a run for a 4-yard touchdown that's a game winner, the quarterback did that too, and that's tough to quantify. That's why ultimately I almost go back to, if you have enough games, maybe just wins and losses ultimately get you there over time, but we never get there over time for small sample size QBs.
I mean, the problem with the clutch in football is it's all difficult, right? Like, we can construct all these narratives for everything, which may or may not be true and can certainly be backed up by data, but it might also just be the variance in everything. And it's so, like, clutch is so specific to those incredible, like, it's like when you get to, the Euros are going on right now, or the World Cup, and there are specific teams, England, obviously, right, always choke on penalties. You're like, well, how do you practice? How do you handle penalties? How do you practice penalties? And there's simply, obviously you have to practice them, but there's no way of replicating that high pressure environment of the knockout penalty shootout in a major tournament in the semifinals or the final. You can't replicate that. There's no way of creating that pressure again. So every narrative we create off the back of it may or may not exist, or it may just be, statistical variance that we are dressing up as reality. So I can't believe I'm going to open this door, but
do it.
What did baseball tell you when you looked at a different sport that is much more, able to replicate these situations time and time again?
Well, baseball told me that people just love having the same argument, for 50, 60 years as we did for the past 10. So there's that. But they found, generally speaking, that, clutchness, which for baseball, in terms of hitting, generally tended to express itself as an elevation of the level of play. And the problem here, of course, is that clutch baseball moments are exceedingly small samples. And so it's actually really difficult to detect in a year, how many game-winning hit opportunities somebody has versus how many game-winning hits they have, despite the fact that the baseball season is so long, just because a lot of games are out of hand by the time you get to, or I shouldn't say out of hand, there's always a chance, but generally out of hand, by the time you get to the 7th inning or something like that. So there's not a lot of clutch opportunities, relatively speaking, in baseball. And so they're dealing with a sample size issue. And so they try to create a method to detect clutchness, and then they create a whole fake data set to see if that method will detect clutchness, and if it's a whole deal. But largely, they found that clutchness probably doesn't exist insofar as it's a quality that you should care about when you're attempting to put together a team or figuring out batting order or whatever. But there are probably players that are a little bit better in these situations than other players. If we have a long enough or a large enough sample to say that this player elevates or doesn't get worse in these critical moments, and it takes players with a relatively long career, and sometimes it's players that you wouldn't expect. Bill Buckner showed up as one of the most clutch hitters of all time.
That was
so
funny.
you know
That was you even know Bill Buckner, right, Sam?
Uh-huh.
Wow. Yeah.
Well,
poor
that
Billy
sort of,
Buck.
okay, obviously that's hilarious, but that raised a question to me of like, can you be, let's assume clutch does exist and is a real thing and is repeatable. Like, can you be a clutch person if you've had one catastrophic mistake somewhere in the clutch? Or does that immediately eradicate you from being a clutch player? Like, you know, even if it's an exaggerated version, like could Bill Buckner have actually been a clutch player who just made one of the worst mistakes ever?
A bad error when he was on his bad ankles, and it was already a tie game. So, you know.
Yeah, and it was Game 6, not Game 7.
It was Game 6. Now, I played for Bob Stanley was the pitcher at the time. He was my pitching coach in Double-A. Rich Gedman was the catcher for that, and he was my manager. The Worcester Tornadoes. Never played for Billy Buck, but 2/3 of the people that any Boston fan was like, oh, it was Stanley's fault because he threw a wild pitch. It was Gedman's fault because he should have caught the ball, and then it was Buckner's fault because of the error. But I got to play for 2 of those guys.
Nice.
Yeah, that's my baseball connection there.
And yet it didn't rub off. You could get through an ad.
Yeah.
I mean, not to go down too much. You opened up baseball, man. But the time that I was closest to the majors was in 2008. And the analytical idiot that I am, I'm sitting there in Double-A. I had a sub-1 ERA. That's really good, Sam, after the first month of the season, you know? And I had unbelievable numbers with runners in scoring position. I kept putting guys on base and then getting out of the inning. And the analytical person in me was like, you can't keep this up. This is ridiculous. But the Giants didn't. They weren't thinking about that. The Giants were like, Steve's got a great ERA. He's got a bunch of strikeouts. Like, move him up to AAA. And eventually it did even out. I was getting very lucky, but the Giants thought I was like, you know, a star.
Yeah.
For at least, you know, the first half of the season.
What that's like the other element of being an elite athlete, right? In a rational confidence in yourself, despite all of the data suggesting that you probably should not be this confident
that's
about
why
yourself.
I didn't, Arif, that's why I didn't make it, is because I'm sitting there overthinking it. I'm like, oh, I'm not as good as this ERA shows. This is never going to last.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine if Eli Manning thought that about himself, you know, midway through his first Super Bowl run?
Or any quarterback ever?
There's no... Well, yeah, it would require him to have an internal monologue, which is impossible.
I texted this to Steve yesterday. There was those, you know, career numbers against Tom Brady was doing the rounds on Twitter yesterday. Like every NFL team nobody has a winning record against Brady. And three,
obviously.
But the funniest stat in there to me was that the Giants were 0-3 against Brady at home, right? They never beat him in their own building, but were 2-0 against Brady in Super Bowls.
That's incredible. They got pretty close in 2007 in the regular season.
Right.
That was a good game. Yeah. Really good game.
Like a 3-point game or something like that. But yeah, like I think some of it just has to be like, Drop Play Dave, has this meme about Eli Manning just never having his brain on and that being actually his superpower. And you watch him play and you're like, yeah, I see that. That makes sense to me. And you have to be aggress late in games in order for that to work. And
I think there's definitely that part of it. That aggression, however you get there, whether it's your Jameis Winston and you just have that YOLO, like that's how you play anyway, that you need that aggressive part of it late in the game. But the other thing is like how completely dependent you are on other players making this happen, right? Like Eli has the helmet catch, which is obviously a huge part of his Super Bowl narrative, his mystique. I mean, it was a great play to get out of the grasp and heave a ball downfield, but there was a lot of work that needed to be done from that point on for that to conclude with the narrative in the Super Bowl.
Oh, that pass is incomplete like 99% of the time.
And similarly,
Oh,
in Tom Brady's maybe his greatest comeback, 28-3, he threw the ball straight to a DB for the Edelman catch. The catch that, like the diving,
catch was ridiculous.
Picking it up off the floor, that was thrown straight to a DB. It was in his hands, and it went right through, and that's why he ended up having to dive
after that,
to the
he
floor.
balled out.
But if that happens, right? If boom, pick, game over, done. How does that affect like Clutch Brady, his legacy, all those kinds of things? You're dependent on
not
all
a whole
these.
lot. I mean, because there's a big enough sample size. I mean, he was doing it since year one.
Sure,
really.
but that's his greatest
biggest
one.
comeback,
That's his
yeah.
biggest comeback,
Right.
the one that you would talk about now, and it could have ended right then with a pick.
But like Arif, that you mentioned, like Eli Manning is the type of quarterback I would expect to see high on the comeback charts because of how he played. Nick Foles is high on comeback charts as well. He's the other guy that just like his whole career was volatile, and his style of play. I used to always joke like he'll be like, oh, there's a free rusher coming at me. I'm going to make a throw. I don't care. I'm going to chuck it up. You can see it right there. He's got one of the highest comeback rates, and so Foles was so aggressive with guys in his face and under pressure. And sometimes it was a disastrous pick, and sometimes it was like, man, that thing's getting completed down the field. So Foles has always been good in those situations. But then if you asked me, hey, will Phillip Rivers be high in these situations? I'd say, yeah, of course. He's aggressive. He throws the ball down the field, and he's awful in comeback situations if you're just looking at comeback percentage or whatever high-level stat you're looking at. So it seems like style might help predict it. Andrew Luck, his aggressiveness, he's always been really good. You used to always say, Sam, he sets the fire and then puts it out.
Yeah.
But it doesn't
Yes.
still work across the board, right, for every type of quarterback.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What's interesting about Eli Manning is that his like career comeback percentage is like slightly above NFL average. Like he has a comeback win rate of somewhere around 23%. The NFL average is like 19%. And so it just occurred in these two isolated chunks that happened to coincide consecutively, which results in a Super Bowl. But like to your original point, Sam, that's something that Timo brought up when I was talking to him about, this clutchness stuff. He's like, well, okay, we're talking about clutch quarterbacks, and hey, there might be something here with a clutch quarterback, but why wouldn't there be something with like a clutch left guard or a clutch, outside corner, right? The 21 other players in the field also have to respond to pressure in some way.
Right.
They might also all have to elevate or not decline in response to situational pressure. They might all have to get better at 2-minute drills. They might all have to get better at shutting out the noise or embracing the particularity or the emotional resonance of the situation. They all have to do that. And if your left tackle is like bad in the clutch, like here's something like, again, I follow the Vikings. Teddy Bridgewater was like extremely good at these situations. And we saw that at Louisville. We actually saw that with the Vikings. His clutch comeback win percentage is actually all right, over his career. But I recall anecdotally Teddy Bridgewater doing a very poor job actually winning a lot of these games. In part, there he is. In clutch PFF grade. He didn't actually win a ton of these games. You see here that he's one of the unluckiest quarterbacks in comeback win rate versus what you'd expect based off of his PFF grades in those situations, because Matt Khalil was not clutch. The number of times he has a 2-minute drive that he drives into scoring position only for like an instant sack to take him down. I can recall at least 2-3 times, especially I think there's a Cardinals game that sticks out in my memory. There's an instant sack of Teddy Bridgewater as he sets up for like a game-winning touchdown. And that's not Teddy's fault, right? He performed well enough in that situation to be able to generate something here. You can't control your defense. Like, this is the issue here with Joe Burrow. Number one on this unluckiest quarterbacks in the clutch list. Joe Burrow plays at a high level, one of the highest levels of play that we see in these clutch situations, often actually scores in these situations, and then the defense gives up a big play. And the quarterback can't control that at all. And so he ends up with a win percentage that is, really remarkably bad. in these situations. Here you see the total comeback win percentage is 16.7%. Like I said, the average is about 19%. And so Burrow, who's a history of strong play overall, in a history of individually excellent play in the clutch, just cannot produce a win despite, everything under his control going his way, because everything not under his control isn't going his way. Sometimes, Eli Apple's on your team. What are you going to do about that?
The interesting thing there is I think there's probably elements of truth, like the Matt Khalil example, but like I was saying earlier, I think the QB is still in just a different animal, because the left tackle
for sure.
isn't dictating his situation. But the proxy there is like, how good is Matt Khalil in pass protection in must-pass situations, right? And that's why it's like, okay, maybe that's not going to work. Because that's the other part of football, right? We hear coaches all the time talking about we need to run to set up the pass and pass to set up the run. You are literally changing the game. As you said earlier, it's a 2-minute drill. The defense knows you're passing. You lose the level of deception. Therefore, it makes sense that the higher skilled players, the better pass protectors, the better receivers, and then, of course, the better quarterbacks, should be better in these situations, because you lose the deception, right? You don't have that discussion, well, Tua is a system quarterback because of all the play action, or Brock Purdy has Kyle Shanahan and he's got the play action deception. You lose that in a lot of these situations, the way we're defining it. So it does get to the pure, like, okay, when they know what you're doing, can you still produce? And so I think that's why it always ends up pointing generally to the better quarterbacks over time.
Well, also, so you did a lot of kind of piecing together of studies across, various different sports, and the general feel seemed to be that pressure does impact performance, but usually impacts it the most on bad players, right? Is that a reasonable summation?
Yeah. So it turns out that like situational pressure impacts everybody a little bit, unless you're in the bottom tier of players, in which case it impacts you a lot. We see this with tennis players a lot. We see this a little bit with golfers. We see this with kickers in football, so not even just across sports in football. Kickers don't get like better in the clutch, but some of them get a lot worse, and they tend to be the kickers that are also just worse in general. So if you've got a kicker that's kicking, and field goal percentage is a bad stat, but I'll just use it here for illustrative purposes. If you got a kicker kicking like 72% or something like that, that's a bad kicker, right? That kicker is much more likely to also be sensitive to, choking and pressure like that. And that kind of makes sense a little bit too, right? Like the whole point of being a good kicker is being consistent. Everybody has the baseline level of talent necessary to hit like a 45-yard field goal. If you're an NFL kicker, you can mechanically you can kick a 45-yard field goal. The question is how consistent you are. And for kickers especially, that consistency comes from the ability to do the same thing repeatedly under intense conditions. And so if you had a bad night's sleep, or if you just got into a fight with your girlfriend, that'll impact you. Kickers can't have like a bunch of stuff messing up, the way that they approach things. And so a bad kicker might let this outside noise impact them when there isn't any situational pressure, when they're just kicking like in the second quarter. And so they'll miss a kick because, they're worried about their mortgage or whatever, right? And a good kicker has no idea what a mortgage is. Like you're just kicking. That's for the love of it, right?
Well,
that's the kind of player that will also probably choke in regards to, situational pressure or respond to icing. So pressure tends to impact people who in non-pressure situations are already playing worse than the baseline level of play, or especially the elite level of play.
And I wonder how tied that is to what you were saying earlier, Steve. So on the one hand, you could paint that as like, mental strength, right? Mental fortitude. You could also just say in order to be an elite level athlete, you need to be a little bit demented and deranged and completely irrational, right? So it affects the players that aren't that way, that don't have that bulletproof self-confidence, irrational self-confidence, but all of those players have that, and the ones that don't are the guys that get affected and are the guys that are probably not great players, because you need to be crazy to be a great player.
This will be my last baseball reference until the next one, but
sure. Yeah.
Madison Bumgarner was my teammate, right? I was there for his first professional day. He was a pitcher for the Giants, first-round pick, and eventual World Series hero. I think it was the 2014 World Series. And he was just like laid back country boy. Like he got in trouble a couple years ago because he was like a fake rodeo star on the side. He just like wanted to do rancher thing. Look up that story.
That rules.
Yes. He just wanted to do like rancher things, right? And he just happened to be a lefty that could throw 95 with a nasty slider. And so you got analytical me, who, every time I had success was like, oh no, this is going to regress, or, how do you maintain this? How do you stay in the zone? And I'm watching Bumgarner pitch in Game 7 of the World Series on 1 day of rest after pitching a lot, and I'm like, his arm has to be killing him, because you're on 1 day of rest after a starter, your arm is killing you to be pitching, and he's just out there just like, I don't know, whatever, I'm just going to throw a fastball. Like you could just see it, you see it on his face. He's like, oh, catcher put down a 1, throw fastball. Oh, he put down a 3, throw slider. And he looked like it could have been spring training in Scottsdale, Arizona in March, or it could have been Game 7 of the World Series, and nothing changed.
But this is why, they always get pilloried for this, and it seems stupid. But, the idea that when it comes out that a random NFL player likes the clarinet, right? And it's like, oh, that's a big red flag. Can't have that. That guy's focus is somewhere else. He's thinking about things. Huge problem. You want them not just to be laser focused on football, but you don't want enough going on upstairs where they can start thinking about this stuff and actually get in their own head and remove, actually create this susceptibility to pressure and to failing.
But each position's different too. We've had Joe Thomas on here and Andrew Whitworth, and how technical and sharp offensive linemen are, and how they have to have a lot of their information in their brain. And then we know that someone like a cornerback is so reactionary. It's like, yeah, you want Sherm's really sharp, and he knows route concepts, and because that was good for their system. But if you're just like a man, press man corner, do you actually want to be thinking a whole lot? So it is interesting that it's almost like different by position too sometimes.
There might also just be like a sliding scale here between how capable someone is of compartmentalizing, which is its own skill set,
sure,
and how dumb they are, I guess, is the way that we're going to approach this one, the way that we've talked about this. And so
I was not trying to couch it like that, Arif. Was not trying to say that.
So Steve says that Madison Bumgarner is dumb. That's what I'm getting.
No,
can we clip that for social right now?
Just an incredible clutch athlete is what Madison is.
But yeah, I mean, if there is a lot of capacity for in the moment thinking, which is in a lot of cases is a bad thing, you're going to want a guy that also has the ability to compartmentalize, because Richard Sherman, I think, is a wonderful example of this, because he plays a position that requires a lot of instinctive play, and even in in the zone heavy scheme that he excelled in, it just requires him to react without thinking. Also, when he sits down to think, he is just insanely sharp, right? And part of it is just, he can compartmentalize. And, for some players, that's a more important skill than others. I think that, at cornerback especially, just the ability to compartmentalize is so huge, to the point where, in order to play cornerback at an NFL level, you must have irrational confidence. I think more than any other position, irrational confidence plays a huge role, right? And I think the same thing kind of applies to clutchness and maybe across positions, where the ability to compartmentalize or the ability to segment, your understanding that this is going to be, a huge deal, right? Or that this is like a significant moment. You can maybe recognize that analytically, but you have to kind of shelve it and just play. Right. And which, goes back to the stuff about aggressiveness. It goes back to, the conversations we're having about Jameis and Eli. But there's probably a sliding scale here where, at some level, it's good to have an analytical player that's willing to be introspective, that's willing to think through all these situations, but probably not in the moment, as a pass rusher is bearing down or something like that, or as the ball is in the air. So, these are probably real world skills that map onto this very nebulous concept of clutchness, which is hard to define and extremely hard to measure. But there is probably something here, which is probably why there is something in the data that suggests that after you account for basically all of these other elements, strategic play, overall baseline level of quality, that the model improves when we include clutch play, when we're trying to predict future clutch play. It is a small improvement in the model. It's still better to just be good. As Timo put it, you'd rather have a version of Peyton Manning that's never clutch than a version of Zach Wilson who's always clutch in clutch moments. Like, you just rather have a higher baseline level player. But it does seem like there is something to the kind of talent that you need. And to your point, Steve, about, quarterbacks, like, they're the most important position in a large enough sample size. That talent level, that talent difference of an elite quarterback is going to express itself in wins. It just takes a large sample because, if you add it all up, the 21 other players on the field do matter more than the quarterback. It's just individually the quarterback matters the most. And because that's the case, it's going to take a large sample for us to see that in overall wins. And then in particular here in clutch situations where you don't have the luxury of large sample, it's going to take an even larger, a group of eligible plays for us to be able to detect it.
Yeah, I think that was the sort of key element there, was that even in the clutch situations, you want the choker, effectively, if he's a better player than the guy that's super clutch but just isn't good. Like, it's whatever this is, and it does seem to exist. Like, from all these studies, from all of your work, there does seem to be something there, right? It's difficult to measure. It's extremely hard to nail down because we can't even agree on a definition, let alone identify all of those specific clutch situations. But by and large, they seem to agree that it is something that is a factor, this ability to react to pressure. It's not a large enough thing that it would make you, you're not even breaking ties with it necessarily. You're certainly not using it to say, well, we have this guy who's not as good as our starter, but he's more clutch, so let's throw him in now.
Yeah, and I think I read a study in basketball about setting up like a game-winning shot when it's a tie or win type shot, and how you would design a play for a player and determine which person is taking that shot. By far the most important thing, I think 11 times more important than performance in clutch situations, is performance in general. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? It's just distributed among the stars in basketball, especially the shooters, distributed among them are some that are a little bit better in clutch situations than others. But you're still going to ask your best shooter to take the shot, or at least you should. And you shouldn't, design your play for a clutch, okay, or above average shooter if you've got the ability to access an elite shooter. And once you take into account stuff like teams know who's going to that guy, you take into account like defensive pressure, you take into account like, hey, you're down by 3, so they know that you got to shoot from beyond the arc, and so we're just going to vacate the middle and defend the perimeter. Once you account for like the difficulty of these shots or something like that, it does reveal itself a little bit clearer that there are some clutch shooters. But there's never a moment, especially because in basketball you only have like 5 players, right, to choose from ideally. There's never a moment where you're going to change your decision based off of the information that you have about clutchness. You should just pick the best shooter on your team. Like, maybe if you're in this insane situation where you happen to say have, I don't know, Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, where maybe clutchness could be a dividing line here, maybe because they're both insane 3-point shooters. But in that case, in that specific example, it doesn't matter because Steph Curry is also clutch. But hypothetically, if Klay Thompson was a more clutch shooter, you could maybe make the argument in this 1 in a million scenario where you happen to be the 2015 Golden State Warriors, where maybe you would draw it up for the other guy if the other guy happened to demonstrate some level of clutchness. But that's a crazy scenario, like to have that embarrassment of riches for you to be like, well, I've got 2 elite superstar 3-point shooters. In that situation, okay, you're better off picking the guy who is demonstrably more clutch.
But even then, the tiebreaker before the clutch thing is probably the sort of the X's and O's of the game situation. Like, they are more likely to throw extra bodies, extra attention on Steph Curry, so we can actually use Klay Thompson, who happens to be more clutch anyway. So it's like that's the sort of tiebreaker. It's actually, we can get a better shot for Klay Thompson than we can for Steph Curry.
Yes.
And he happens to be more clutch.
Yeah. Like play design here would be, in that situation, maybe an overriding factor over the specific clutchness of a player. And you understand that everyone's going to be crowding Curry a lot more than they're going to be crowding Thompson. And so in that case, that is probably a prior consideration too than like a clutch factor that you've identified in one and not the other, given that you have like the sample of like 100 clutch shots from either of them. Which also it's kind of difficult to get to that point because before you get that data, you're probably just funneling your shots to Curry. Like you're trying to win games, not develop a data set so that later on you can win some future ephemeral game.
I mean, the bottom line on all this too, it's like the question of from a media or how we react to this stuff perspective, this stuff affects players' legacies and how we think of them. And I think when Brady and Mahomes are sitting at the top of all these charts at the end of Mahomes' career and you're comparing the two, like there'll probably be some information there for those first take debates in 2035, right? Like that, there'll be some information there. But I don't think there's information there in team building decisions or in now decisions. Like to the earlier point, it's like, do I take this QB or this QB? They're not going to be, there's no such thing as all things equal, choose the clutch guy if you're signing a free agent QB. So like I don't even know if there's decisions to be made other than, can you reprogram a Kirk Cousins, right? Can you take a Kirk Cousins who might have been so conservative in those clutch situations and you saw KOC? Because if you just look at like Cousins' performance in those situations, like throw for throw, I don't even know if it was better. He was just making smarter throws and and getting better results, right? Being a little bit more aggressive. So to me, that's like the only decision there is maybe make sure you're programming guys to play a certain way to increase. I mean, it's just like making a better fourth down decision,
right?
So that you can go to like, from 50% win to 55% win probability, whatever it is. It's like a few percentage points. But anyway, Arif, what did you find when you studied this, when you were lead data scientist on this problem here?
Yeah. Josh Allen is criminally underrated in the clutch. That's one thing I found.
Nice.
He's insanely good.
He just missed the throw to go to the AFC Championship. How is that possible?
Turns out, his 21 other teammates weren't as clutch as he was. But yeah, there's like not a moment where you're going to make like a roster building decision where this is going to impact. It really is just in post play narratives, and Mahomes happens to be both like really insanely talented and skilled, and also pretty lucky in a lot of these situations, right? And so that combination has produced, Mahomes having the greatest fourth quarter comeback percentage. It's better than Brady. It's better than Montana. And then I created an adjusted fourth quarter comeback that weights, playoff comebacks to be like 3 times more important. And in that situation, Mahomes, he's nearly 50% here. Like I just want to like emphasize how insane that is. To win half the games where you're down. No one does that. Like it's a 19% is the average here. Like that's a insane scenario. Obviously Mahomes is talented, but obviously he's also benefiting from a lot of luck. And when you combine luck and talent, you get legacies like Mahomes, you get legacies like Brady. And when you've got talent and a lack of luck, you've got like a Tony Romo, who it turns out is actually a lot more clutch than we remember based off of my studies. But yeah, what I found is clutchness exists, and it kind of doesn't matter. Like great, we found it. Now there's nothing we can do with this fact, which is like a lot of data science, I suppose.
That was I described that as like the early PFF days. We would look at the grades and be like, oh, this corner's playing great through 5 weeks. And now we're just like, oh, this guy has a good grade through 5 weeks. That's coming back down to earth. So I'm not going to, like, we sit here in the podcast 10 weeks into the season like, oh, we're only 10 weeks in. I don't even know if we've learned anything yet, So we've changed from actually, reacting to stuff to just like, I don't know, let's wait and see. We don't have enough information. It's unfortunately, that's how data works, though.
Yeah, and it's the problem with clutch, right? The fundamental problem is it's all narrative based and driven off these one or two insanely high leverage situations, which may or may not have been completely luck driven. Like Brady's Edelman catch versus the interception that he tried to throw on the same play flips that narrative 180 degrees, right? From he choked in the key situation to he's clutch in the biggest comeback in Super Bowl history. And, Tony Romo, like one of the biggest things anyone remembers is him botching that hold, right, on a kick. It's like it's not even his main job.
It doesn't show up in the
Why is he
QB
there?
stats.
Yeah.
But it like that folds into he's choker, serial choker, could never win the, it was completely the opposite of choke or of clutch because of like that one ridiculous play as a holder.
Yeah, and these individual plays hold our brains hostage, really, more than anything else, right? Like if the Bills, if they extend their drive by like 10 more seconds, Mahomes only has 3 seconds to engineer 50 yards, which, with him maybe, right? Like, yeah, I'm not going to count it out until it happens, but for the most part, like, that's not in Mahomes' control how much time is left on the clock when he takes the field, and it very much could have been that the clock expires when the Bills, score their go-ahead score in that championship game to prevent, a Chiefs comeback at all. In which case, now suddenly Josh Allen, who scored in that situation, by the way, is clutch, and Mahomes doesn't have an opportunity to respond. And, it probably doesn't dig that much, against Mahomes' legacy in this particular scenario, but there are just a couple of situations where that's happened for Mahomes, and the ball has bounced in his favor a little bit, and it's come at the expense of quarterbacks like Joe Burrow and Josh Allen, who have been really talented in these situations, but just haven't had the ball bounce their way. But that's just how narratives work, right? Sometimes you convert a 4th and 28 by checking down to your running back for some reason.
Even the Super Bowl this year, right? The Niners had one play to win the game, 3rd and 4. Brock Purdy throws the slant, and was it McDuffie coming off the edge that batted it? I mean, it's batted at the line of scrimmage, right?
Yeah,
and it's like if they complete that, the Niners win, and the Chiefs don't have a chance for the. I mean, and there's a million of those, right? In every QB's career, where it's like, yeah, you needed a key defensive play here or play there, just to have the opportunity, just to be able to create that legacy, whatever it may have been. So you found it.
Yeah,
might exist,
but nobody cares.
Doesn't matter.
Perfect.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. And then we're not going to use this going forward when we define somebody's legacy. No one's going to look at, I'm sorry, I love PFF, but no one's going to look at PFF grade in the fourth quarter when determining if Mahomes is a more clutch quarterback than Josh Allen.
No, you're right. It's happening. It's there. It's that we found it. It does exist. Everybody cares, and it doesn't matter at all.
I'll say this though, because I don't even think PFF grade. I think it's informative. I don't think that's the best proxy for sorting fourth quarter performance though, because again, I think it doesn't bake in, like if you make this aggressive 30-yard throw and you overthrow it, you're going to get a negative. But I want you to make that throw, right? And I don't care if you miss three 30-yard passes if you make the fourth one, right? And it's not going to show up in the grade, but the thought process is probably correct. You know what I mean? So like I wouldn't even use I think PFF grade is informative, and again, over time it gets you there. But the way you combined it with adjusted net yards per attempt, like that, combining it with something else in that situation probably is a better way to do it. Whereas I would say, like, if you look at just all QB stats, I would take PFF grade over all the other QB stats. If you're using the full data set, I would use that as the primary stat. But I wouldn't necessarily in this situation, because I think your decision matters a little bit more and doesn't necessarily get baked into the grade as much.
Yeah, like a success rate metric here, like layered on top of it, would probably be, because again, incompletion, interception, both the same kinds of failures. So like even in that situation, it's like, you want him to make an aggressive throw. You don't want to punish him too badly for having made that throw. And the way that PFF grades are, I mean, every statistic has weaknesses, right? And the way that PFF grades are crafted, makes it so that ends up being something that somebody's gonna punish. But yeah, I think in terms of like if you're a coach trying to figure out what to do with like clutchness and stuff like that, like figure out ways to make sure that your quarterback is playing at an even keel, figure out ways to improve strategic considerations overall, and then kind of the rest will just kind of fall in there for you, right? Like, Kevin O'Connell improved Kirk Cousins' clutch play a little bit, in part because of luck and in part because he was just like, hey man, I'm not going to bench you for throwing an interception in the fourth quarter, so just do it.
Kevin O'Connell had, how many comebacks did Stafford have in 2021? Didn't he have? I think he had a slew of them in 21, and then Cousins had the 8 in 22, right? So O'Connell is the most clutch.
Stafford is a remarkable, like in terms of total fourth quarter comebacks, he's like way up there.
Right.
And it just started in 2016. Like this reputation just emerged. He ended up with like 8 fourth quarter comebacks in 2016, and then I think in 21 he had like 5 or 6, which led the league.
Right.
And then Cousins, had 8, tying Stafford's record in fourth quarter comebacks. And it's like, if you were to identify the most clutch quarterbacks, you would not have picked those two. But a lot of quarterback talent is just not getting in that situation in the first place. Like, Mahomes has like 14 career fourth quarter comebacks or something like that. That's because he's just winning games in the fourth. He doesn't have to come back. He's winning by like 3 scores.
Yeah, that's
way more important.
That's why I think the percentages are definitely the way to go. It was interesting to me though that O'Connell was in this like 2-year stretch of being the play caller or offensive coordinator, whatever you want to call it, with Stafford and Cousins. And I do wonder if you don't have Brady or Mahomes, is there something to the play caller? Maybe that's like the next layer of figuring out if there's a certain way of viewing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, having a play caller willing to coach the quarterback the right way and then draw up plays that are uniquely designed for those scenarios probably helps. Like you said, Stafford had like 5 or 6 in 21, and then Cousins. The comeback percentage, I think, of those two combined over those seasons where O'Connell, and I should look into this more deeply now, is like over 40%, which, like I said, 19% is the average. That's nuts.
10,000 more words on clutch offensive coordinators and why Kyle Shanahan isn't one and the other guys are. Oh, I like it. So I know you got to go, Arif, but yeah, tell everybody where they can read all 10,000 of these words and get more information here.
Yeah, you can head over to wideleft.football. It's my newsletter. I cover the Vikings a little bit. I cover the NFL at large. I also cover politics. So if you're scared of talking about politics, just don't click on those articles. And culture. So there's a lot of Aaron Rodgers is like a dangerous conspiracy theorist. Let's talk about it type stuff over there.
Nice.
All right. Well, thanks, Arif. We appreciate you taking the time, and go check them out. Wide Left Football. Thanks, man.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Sam?
Steven?
Back to us. Now we can look at each other and discuss. Any takeaways on that?
Yeah, look, I mean,
it's a fun conversation.
It is. It's a really interesting conversation. It's ultimately sort of slightly frustrating because of the conclusion that we came to, which I think actually summed it up well, which is it is real. It does exist. You can measure it. Everyone cares about it, but it doesn't really matter. It's such a small thing. And I think the biggest single problem is still there's just no way of replicating those. There's such a small sample size. Like ultimately to me, I don't even necessarily want to find the guys that are most clutch. I want to find the guys that are going to choke and not have the ball in their hands. You know what I mean? Whether it's football, whether it's any other sport. Like you want to avoid the Rory McIlroy collapse in the Masters, in the what was it, the USPGA? That's what you want to avoid, right? The two like that. It was so obvious, I think, to everybody watching that McIlroy was going to choke that. He had made, was it 496 straight putts from inside 3 feet, something like that, and then missed one. You're like, that's choking, right? There's something there that is ultimately manifests in these broader numbers in more general clutch situations, but that's what we're trying to zero in on, right? Is this hyper pressure situation, just a few holes left in a major with you in the lead, like set up, those situations, and that's when you break. That's what you want to find and avoid.
Does that mean he's going to do it the next time, though?
No, but does it mean that he's more prone to do that than other players? Certainly McIlroy is building that reputation, and I think it's one that exists. Like I think that's when it most obviously exists in worse players, right? These guys that do have a mental frailty, and when the pressure comes on the most, they choke. Now, most of those guys are just not good players to begin with because those good players have that bulletproof mentality and those kinds of things. But I think every now and again you find a guy that's a really, really good player at something, whether it's football, basketball, golf, baseball, whatever. You find this guy that's really, really good as a baseline, but has a proclivity to choking, has a susceptibility to pressure.
A-Rod.
And those are that's what you want to try and find. But there's, as I said before, there's just no way of replicating those situations to test it out on a large sample size. Like you can't replicate the pressure of a penalty to win or lose a World Cup final. You can't. There's no way of doing it. So ultimately, there's no way of putting a bunch of guys in a battery of tests and saying, all right, is this guy going to miss or lose or score his penalty in this situation because there's just no way of replicating that pressure. I think that's the biggest fundamental problem with all this is there's no way of setting up a control for intense pressure versus non-intense pressure.
So I think, I mean, as far as like making a decision, when you're saying I don't want the Rory McIlroy, like what do you do? Let me just back up really quick. I think over time, wins and losses actually get you in the ballpark, right? The fact that Brady sits atop, and Arif was tracking it a little bit differently, right? There's people that track it with when you have a fourth quarter opportunity, you're within a score, what's your win-loss percentage, right? Pretty crude, but not as crude. Like he was going with all fourth down scenarios, right? Or fourth quarter. And Brady's got the highest percentage, and Mahomes is second. And Mahomes has a much smaller sample than Brady, but like he'll probably be up there by the end of it in the same range. But then there's guys like Andrew Luck up there and Peyton Manning's up there. So I think that's informative. That's the right list. Now, if you're going to say, well, Mark Sanchez or Nick Foles is up there, it's like, okay, well, what do you do with that? Like
Sanchez, I think, was pretty high.
Sanchez might be up there, especially in the playoffs, and it's like, okay, fine. Like if he just had more opportunities, that's probably not going to maintain. I do think where it's informative, though, is the Aaron Rodgers thing, him being lower, and then Phillip Rivers. Guys like him being lower, because when you're saying like you just don't want the Rory McIlroy, like what do you do when you have Phillip Rivers? So we would say, as analysts, Phillip Rivers had a great career. PFF grade was excellent for his prime, great stats, threw the ball down the field and everything. And then other people are going to say, well, he didn't win the big one, and his record wasn't great. And that is true. He had years where they were the number one seed. They had years where they were not very good, the Chargers with Phillip Rivers. Was there actually something informative there? Where he's like what we described Kirk Cousins to be, which is the stat guy, and maybe not the go out and do whatever it takes to win guy. And I would say, on the surface, I would say that's ridiculous. He doesn't play like that, but the results were kind of like that.
Yeah, so ultimately, I don't know if I would ever be in a situation where like I don't want that guy, right? The Rory McIlroy type. Now, like in golf, there's nothing you can do about it. That's who he is. That's just the reality of the situation. But in football, we're sort of talking about this from a roster construction, team management point of view. So you end up with you can replace a guy, right? You can say, well, if this guy is a choker, do we get rid of him for somebody else? So I generally don't think you're ever going to be in that spot, but it might end up being the way it is with coaches, where these guys win 10 games every year, but don't get any further. And ultimately you reach a point where the owner says, that's not good enough. It's time to go away. Even knowing that there's a huge chance you're going to get worse from that point of view, right? That's a really good baseline. Like people are agitating over Mike Tomlin at the moment for this reason. He doesn't win in the playoffs anymore, right? When was the last time Mike Tomlin went on a playoff run? Even though he's got this record of the man has never had a losing season as a coach. And in recent years, that's been more impressive than ever because he hasn't had a quarterback.
I think both. I've come full circle on the Tomlin thing. Both narratives are completely overrated.
Right, but this might be that. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying it happens, right? Mike Tomlin is. I'm not saying he's on a hot seat, but there are people saying that you should get rid of Mike Tomlin. Mike Shanahan got fired after 2 Super Bowl wins because eventually they weren't winning enough. They were just being good at getting, thereabouts and not progressing. The various coaching staffs get cleaned out on the back of those types of runs. So maybe this is an identifier for a quarterback where you say, okay, he's going to be good. We're going to be in the playoffs because he's a really good player, but ultimately, what are the chances that this guy is not going to implode at some point in the postseason? Like, can we actually win a Super Bowl with this guy as a quarterback? And is he so good that we can overlook what appears to be a history of choking? Like, it becomes a factor, like, in that. So Kirk Cousins in recent years with the Vikings, like, it would be an element, right? You look at this and you say, okay, we've just been looking at that of variance, right? Can Kirk Cousins, he's good, he'll get you to the postseason. Is he good enough to go on a run and win a Super Bowl? His baseline of play, no, not really. But if you hit the high end, sure. What are the chances of that happening? That was what they were basing. Now, if you could also fold in, also in the most critical situations, there's a higher or lower chance of him imploding. Yeah. Now you can start, I think that would start informing that type of decision.
I try to remind people too, before 2000, Foles won in 2017 with the Eagles, but before 2014, when 70% of Super Bowls were Brady or Mahomes, there was that stretch where Flacco made his run and Eli made 2 runs, and then eventually, Foles did make his run, and it did seem like, okay, Brady's in the mix every year, but if you don't have Brady, if you don't have one of the elite quarterbacks, one of these other more volatile type of quarterbacks could go on the run.
Yeah.
And I thought when Brady retired, you'd say, okay, maybe we'll have more winners, and then Mahomes just kind of like took over and started winning all of them. But again, we're like one play away from Brock Purdy winning. We're one play away from Jalen Hurts winning. So none of this stuff is really definitive when it comes to winning the Super Bowl.
This is the thing, is that I think one of the hardest things in sports to do is to figure out how you analyze success or failure. If your ultimate goal is winning a Super Bowl, which most people's is, right? I'm sure there are some owners that are just happy if they're turning a profit, whatever. But let's assume everybody's goal is to win a Super Bowl. How do you determine success or failure when only one team is going to do that every single year, right? So if you're in a championship game every year, if you're the Bills back in the 90s and you got the 4 straight Super Bowls, what is the conclusion at the end of that? Is the answer, we've come up short 4 straight times, we got to make some changes, right? Or is the actual more important element here, we've been there 4 straight times, nobody's ever done that, let's just keep knocking on the door and eventually it's going to open. Like, the Bills obviously did that. There are teams now that are doing that in the postseason. I mean, other sports as well, like Leinster Rugby, 3 straight European finals, each one of them an absolute nail-biter. Like, is that a sign that there's something fundamentally broken, or simply that luck, like the coin flip that's effectively 50-50 came up tails 3 straight times?
The challenge there is in other sports, like in basketball, you have a bunch of 7-game series in the playoffs.
Yeah.
And if you ask basketball people, they say it's a different game.
Right.
The playoffs are different, right? You play 82-game schedules differently than you play a 7-game series because you're playing the same team over and over again. You don't even have that benefit in football, where I imagine that would exist, right? If the Chiefs and Bills played a 7-game series,
you would assume the better team would win most of the time.
But what I'm saying is you would make team building decisions to say we have to beat the Chiefs this year. Or you would change the way you play football
but
in a 7-game series or a
right.
5-game series or a 3-game series. You would change how you play football and change how you build your team. But in football, you can't even make that adjustment.
But you would also have a much clearer indication of whether or not you were worse than that team. Like if you were losing a 7-game series to a team, right, over in one season.
What I'm saying is,
I know that.
But I'm talking about the matchup aspect
I know,
of it.
But my point is, I don't think teams right now can even figure out if they need to make a change. Like as it currently exists, you have to work on a multi-season sample size where each roster is being turned over 30%. Coaching staffs may be different. Game plan,
I get it. I get
doing that.
Yeah.
And you're saying because we came up short in 3 separate times against what could be 3 separate teams, therefore this is the problem and we need to change this. As opposed to, okay, in one season with theoretically the same team, injuries independent, we're going to play this team 7 times and we're going to get a better idea of whether or not we can beat that team.
Yeah. I'm agreeing because what I'm saying is I don't even know what you can do with that stuff because the Bills keep beating the Chiefs in the regular season. The Bengals are 5-1 against the Bills and the Chiefs, right, over the last couple of years.
Something like that, yeah.
But like, is that just matchup driven type of stuff? So I guess to answer your question on like the Bills of the 90s, if they had enough of a playoff sample, they could say, we've built a really good team to get to the Super Bowl. How do we make a better playoff team? But even then, it's like they won at least 2 playoff games every single year to get to the Super Bowl. Right. It ends up becoming, you missed a field goal and you had a couple random plays here and there and you can't really overhaul things.
I mean, that's where I think it makes it very, very difficult to ever make any kind of decision out of whatever information you may or may not be able to glean out of choking versus clutch, let's say quarterbacks, because that's the only topic we're really hitting on here. Right now, I don't think we're even capable of figuring out whether or not anything needs to change for a team that's coming up short repeatedly, or whether that's simply luck, variance, things going against them.
I struggle more with the Dolphins and the Cowboys. And why they
beat good teams, you don't beat bad teams. Is that an actual thing, or is that simply the way it went this year?
Right, because those were old narratives of, a dome team can't go on the road in the playoffs, right? And those always felt like overblown type of things. And of course, plenty of dome teams went on the road and won games and did that type of stuff. But those are fair questions that have come up, right? The Dolphins are sitting there with the 5th most yards ever through 5 weeks. we had JT O'Sullivan on, and he was like, I don't know if this offense will travel, right? And ultimately, that was true. It didn't travel well.
Right.
It didn't play, but it wasn't even travel. It was bad against good teams. But then it's bad when you just happen to play this game where it's like 28 below in Kansas City, and you don't have enough answers, and you're not as explosive on that turf and everything. So then there's that aspect of, like, what do you do with that information if you're the Miami Dolphins from a team building standpoint? Because everything on paper, to his stats, receiving yards, rushing yards, points per game, like everything looks really good, except you weren't good against good teams. Like, what do you do with that information? Because that's what we keep coming back down to. I think we're talking about player legacy stuff when it comes to the clutch thing, and then we're talking from a team building standpoint. Can you do anything with this information that we have? And it's a tricky one, I think, when it comes to team building.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is ultimately no, because, like I said, if you can't even correctly, confidently identify if something needs to change based off this type of zero-sum evidence, how could you possibly zero it in on not just something needs to change, this player needs to change because he's a serial choker? Like that, based off probably one play in a sequence. Like, in order for a guy to get labeled as a choker, which is already happening to guys like Dak Prescott, right? All that needs to happen is you need to come up short like 3 times, and one of them you have a bad play in. So one of the 3, you need to have a bad play in a bad situation, and now we can call you a choker, and it's time to move on and go in a different direction.
But Dak's interesting because he's been pretty good in recent years in comeback situations, but he hasn't been good in full games in the playoffs. But he also had the game against the Bucs in the playoffs where he didn't even miss a throw, right? Brady's last game there in Tampa Bay. They were unbelievable in that game. What do you do with that information?
Right.
Oh, he can't win in the playoffs. Well, he had one of the best playoff games of any quarterback over the last 2 years. He also had some of the worst games.
Yeah, and
week.
this one in particular this year did absolutely feel like the only logical explanation for this is like an overall choking in this game.
That was the one thing I also wanted to add, right? The quote unquote media, right? As a former player here, Sam, I always thought that the idea of the media talking about this guy chokes and this guy does that was overblown, because, not to oversimplify, but the media is, remember, the guy, the average writer who didn't play sports beyond 12 years old is thinking back oh, when I was in Little League, I got kind of nervous, when you're
right.
And it's that doesn't happen, right? Until the Cowboys get on the field last year, and I'm like, what?
Well,
why do they look different? Why do they actually? Because most athletes don't you get hit, or you make a play, you throw a ball or whatever it is, and you play ball, and it's just you're fine. But the Cowboys literally did look different against the Packers last year in the playoffs.
I don't know that it's that it, and this is another problem with measuring this, right? Is that I don't think it's that those guys sort of don't feel that pressure or those nerves, but it's that you don't know when they're going to feel it. It's not a defined, there's no formula for it, right? In this given set of circumstances, this equals pressure equals nerves. It's most of the time they're not going to feel it, but every now and again, for no good reason, this guy's going to feel weirdly nervous going into a game, right? Or those specific plays. To me, so one of my problems with that idea of comeback as a proxy and for clutch and pressure, et cetera, is Kirk Cousins executes the biggest comeback in NFL history against the Colts, right? 33-0 down at halftime. Most of that comeback is not a pressure situation. When you're 33-0 down, there is no pressure on you. You've lost the game. You're just out there throwing it around and let's see what happens.
That's Kirk Cousins' time, man.
But then
that's his time.
But then at some point in that comeback, it becomes pressure, right?
Yeah.
Because suddenly it's real. What was just theoretical and, hey, guys, let's win the second half. Who knows what could happen, right? Somewhere in that comeback becomes a moment where it's actually, guys, this could happen.
Yeah, we have a chance.
And now the pressure is on, right? And that's not a defined moment either, right? There's no exact moment where, okay, we're within 10 points, now it's pressure. Or we're within a score, it's pressure now. Just somewhere along the line, it transforms from zero pressure whatsoever to intense pressure because the greatest comeback in NFL history is on the line. So I think, I don't think it's sort of reasonable to say, that kind of thing isn't real at all. It's just that you don't know going into a random playoff game whether Dak Prescott's feeling pressure in there or not, right? He might be loving life, just happy-go-lucky, relaxed, not a care in his mind, just another game. Or he might be dude, this is This is intense. This is the game. I don't know. I'm not feeling it.
My legacy's
I'm
on
nervous.
the line.
Right.
Here we go.
And there's literally no way of knowing that without being inside the guy's head.
Yeah, that's why I think, just to wrap it up, my conclusion on all this is it's kind of like we talk about like a PFF grade for corners, and it's a little volatile, and you might say this guy's an 80 this year and he's a 65 the next year, then he's a 90, and it's like, well, it's Tre'Davious White or whoever, and it's like, well, he's a good corner. He's a good corner. He might have a 65 one year, he might have an 80 the next year. It's just the nature of the position. But overall, if you're ranking or rating or evaluating Tre'Davious White, you're like, he's a good corner. And I think in these comeback situations and clutch situations, focus on the process and get the quarterback, or look at the quarterback who has a good process. And you might say Eli Manning had a good process in those situations, or whoever. And maybe Rodgers didn't in those situations. So like those are the things you can control a little bit. We always talk about that chart, are they aggressive when they need to be? Are they conservative when they need to be? Brady and Manning had it, Mahomes has it. Maybe Rodgers was behind compared to some of those other elite guys. Control that process. And then I love the Kevin O'Connell idea here. I don't know if there's something there. Stafford has been doing this for a while, but did he instill something in Cousins to change his process a little bit and say, look, we're still only going to win a small percentage of the time, but we're going to increase those odds by just having better process in these situations.
That might be the only sort of actionable takeaway from this whole idea, is there might actually be a style or an approach to those types of situations that will lead to more wins versus players that don't have that style. So, and that's not necessarily an inherent thing. Like, we could potentially take a guy, like, really, you can't stop a guy being a choker, but you might be able to say, okay, we have a guy that hasn't excelled in these comeback situations, but actually it's because we've been playing a different style and approach, and we can potentially reprogram that in the guy and have a better chance of winning these going forward with the same player.
And I was going to say Jordan Love last year, because this is how I try to bring the analysis to the table. I thought Jordan Love early in the year, I think Steelers game and Raiders game, he was too aggressive. It was like first down, he was chucking into double coverage or whatever it was, if I remember. And that was where it's like, you are with a minute 40 left.
Right.
And so I'm looking at the process, like, you can take 5 yards there. You're allowed to take 5 yards. You don't need to force it yet. And I felt like Jordan Love's process, first half of his first year starting, was off. And then I don't remember how great he was in comeback situations. I just know he was great down the stretch. And I think he was better in those situations as well. So I don't know. That's how I view it, is get to the process of things and put yourself in the best position to succeed in those.
The bottom line to me is, I feel like it is real clutchness. It is measurable. It is detectable. I feel like it is a bigger thing than is measurable, because I don't think you can replicate those most intense pressure situations. So we're sort of focusing so much on, general fourth quarter comebacks or general, proxies for these pressure situations, because there's simply no way of replicating. So I do think that there are players who are quite dramatically affected by intense pressure and are way more prone to quote unquote choking than other guys. But I just don't know that you can ever replicate that. And I also think that the noise, the confounding factors that exist in football more than maybe any other sport, are so much bigger when you're talking about this kind of stuff so you're never going to be able to do anything useful with that information. I think it's probably a bigger thing than you can measure, but ultimately there's no way of you doing anything with it, because you would need to put Tony Romo in, however, like 25 straight high pressure, do or die Super Bowl winning or losing moments to get any kind of, not even a reasonable baseline. Like, that's a terrible sample size.
Just play Madden.
It's still dramatically better than anything you're going to get.
Someone in the chat says Steve seems to struggle with the concept of sports psychology. I mean, if you've heard the entire show, I told you about my struggle with sports psychology and my teammates being great at it. What I'm saying is, the average media person, the average person who's like, oh, that player's nervous in crunch time. By the way, being nervous doesn't mean you're going to be bad, right? Because you're talking about, like, if Dak might have all sorts of feels in the playoffs, and it doesn't mean he's going to, like, he might have been so nervous before the game in Tampa Bay against the Bucs.
Right.
He may have been, crippled with fear going into that game. and then he was really, really good. So nervous doesn't equate to poor performance either, or butterflies or anything like that. So that's why this whole thing is difficult, because at the end of the day, as Arif said, does clutch exist? Yeah. But minute, right. It's like a minute move off of your normal baseline.
Right. I mean, it's an unknown data point, number one. Was he or was he not intensely nervous heading into this game or situation? And then number two, the other unknown data point is because that is unknown, you have no idea whether that affected him positively or negatively.
Yeah.
Did the nerves cause him to choke, or did the nerves focus him and make him have his best game we've seen? No idea.
Glad we solved nothing for almost an hour and a half here.
Well, the line that we came up with, I think, is sadly the most accurate analysis, which is it is real. You can measure it. Everybody cares, and it doesn't matter because you can't do anything with the information that you get out of it. So, and because of the other confounding factors. So that's the bottom line about clutchness.
I mean, over time, I think the best quarterbacks are going to win the most, and they're going to do it in the clutch over time. That's my takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is the most important thing is still the better player.
Wins and losses.
Get the better player.
QB wins are a thing.
Get the better player.
Advocate for QB wins.
The clutch situations will probably take care of themselves because 17 different factors are more important than how clutch the quarterback is anyway. So simply get the best players.
All right, that's it for us today. Don't forget, go check out Monday's show. We redrafted the 2024 NFL draft for our expansion teams, did a little free agency there. It's a fun little show for you to go and review. And then on Monday, we're going to go look back at the last year's rookies, 2023 first rounders, go player by player on the entire first round and review their performance and kind of project them for 2024, what they need to improve or maintain their level of performance. So we'll be doing that on Monday. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll see you again on Monday for a little bit more PFF NFL.